blood rushing in your ears sounds remarkably like a ticking clock when you are waiting to be fed to a monster. Beatrice sat on the edge of a mattress so wide it felt like an ocean of freezing silk. She was 19, sold for a ledger of gobbling debts, bracing for a madman. Mud slapped rhythmically against the undercarriage of the hired coach, a wet, heavy sound that made Beatrice's stomach roll. The interior smelled of sour leather and the stale tobacco her father had been sweating out of his pores for 3 days. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, though there was nothing to see. The Yorkshire moors had swallowed the sun hours ago, leaving only a bruised purple twilight that pressed against the glass like a bruise. She picked at the skin around her thumbnail. It was a nervous habit, one her mother had slapped her for, but her mother was dead and her father was asleep, his chin resting on his chest, a bubble of spittle gathering at the corner of his mouth. Beatrice pulled a sliver of skin. It tore, a sharp sting followed by a bead of hot blood. She pressed it to her skirt, leaving a tiny rust-colored stain on the cheap gray wool. There was no grand bridal gown. There had been no bands read in a sunlit church, no flowers, no trembling smiles. Only a heavy oak table in a solicitor's office in London, the scratching of a nib, and the slide of a heavy canvas bag of coins across the polished wood. The Duke of Rotherham's proxy, a man with cold eyes and breath that smelled of boiled cabbage, had signed the register. Beatrice's father had shoved her shoulder, entirely too hard, urging her to write her name. Oh, now she was the Duchess of Rotherham, the wife of a man 30 years her senior, a man the gossips claimed was kept locked in the West Wing because he howled at the moon, ate his meat bloody, and had driven his previous wives to the grave with his twisted, rotting hands. The carriage lurched to a halt, throwing Beatrice forward. Her knee cracked against the wooden paneling. Pain flared, dull and throbbing, grounding her in the miserable reality of the moment. "Out!" the driver shouted from above, his voice muffled by the driving rain. Her father woke with a start, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He didn't look at her. He simply opened the door, letting in a blast of freezing, rain-soaked air that smelled of wet peat and crushed pine needles. He stepped out, leaving her to follow. The Rotherham estate was not a home. It was a fortress of blackened stone, jutting out of the earth like a decayed tooth. There were no welcoming lanterns, no lines of smiling servants, just a heavy iron-studded door that groaned open to reveal a cavernous hallway. The draft that rushed out tasted like old dust and damp ash. A woman stood in the center of the foyer, holding a single, sputtering oil lamp. She wore a severe black dress that looked stiff enough to stand on its own. "You are late," the woman said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any deference. She did not address Beatrice's father. She only looked at Beatrice, her gaze scraping over the girl's travel-creased dress, the messy knot of her hair, the cheapness of her boots. "The roads," her father muttered, suddenly small and deferential in the vast, oppressive space. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the door. Woody, the transaction was complete. He wanted to leave. He wanted the nearest tavern and a hot fire. "Your carriage may wait in the stables until dawn. Then you will go," the woman instructed him. Finally, she turned fully to Beatrice. "I am Mrs. Gable. Come with me. You need to be scrubbed. You smell of the road." Beatrice didn't look back at her father as she followed the housekeeper up the sweeping, uncarpeted stone stairs. Her boots clacked loudly, echoing into the vaulted ceiling. She felt entirely hollow. There was no defiance in her, no fiery spark of rebellion. She was just cold, exhausted, and sick with a low-level panic that hummed behind her ribs. The bathing room was freezing. 2 maids, rough-handed and silent, stripped her out of her damp clothes. They didn't treat her like a duchess. They handled her like a horse being readied for auction. The water in the copper tub was tepid. Coarse soap, smelling harshly of lye and lavender, was scrubbed over her skin until it burned. Beatrice shivered violently, her teeth clicking together. She hugged her knees to her chest, watching the dirty water slosh against the copper sides. "He is an old man," she told herself, squeezing her eyes shut. "Old men get tired, old men sleep." But the rumors whispered otherwise. They said the madness gave him unnatural strength. They said the estate smelled of decay because of his rotting humors. They hauled her out, drying her with towels that felt like sacking, and dropped a nightgown over her head. It was heavy bleached linen, cold against her raw skin, buttoned high to the throat. It felt like a shroud. Mrs. Gable returned, holding a silver candlestick. The Duke's chambers are in the east wing. He does not like waiting. He does not like noise. You will sit on the bed, and you will not speak unless he addresses you. Beatrice nodded, a jerky mechanical motion. Her throat was too tight to produce a sound. The walk to the east wing was endless. The corridors smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Portraits of sour-faced men and pale women stared down from the shadows, their eyes rendered flat and black by the flickering candlelight. Mrs. Gable stopped before a heavy mahogany door. She didn't knock. She simply turned the brass handle, pushed the door open, and stepped aside. "In!" she commanded. Beatrice stepped over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind her with a dreadful, final sound. The lock tumbled. She was entirely alone. The room was massive, dominated by a four-poster bed, draped in heavy, dark velvet. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, distorted shadows across the Persian rug. The air here was different. It didn't smell of old age and sickness. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, old paper, and something sharp, like brandy and leather. Beatrice walked toward the bed, her bare feet numb against the floorboards. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned in the quiet. She clasped her hands in her lap, her knuckles turning white. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the far corner counted down the seconds of her life. She waited for the shuffle of old feet. She waited for the madman. An hour bled into 2. The red embers in the fireplace pulsed and faded, finally giving way to a pale, creeping chill that seeped through the thick linen of Beatrice's nightgown. Her spine ached from sitting perfectly straight. The muscles in her thighs jumped with involuntary tremors. The silence of the house was so absolute it had begun to ring in her ears. Perhaps he forgot, she thought, a pathetic, desperate flare of hope catching in her chest. Perhaps his madness keeps him wandering the moors. Perhaps he is asleep. A sudden, sharp clack echoed from the hallway. Beatrice flinched, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of heavy-booted footsteps approached. They were not the slow, shuffling steps of an infirm elder. They were rhythmic, purposeful, and heavy enough to rattle the floorboards beneath the rug. She scrambled backward on the bed, her heel catching on the hem of her oversized nightgown. She kicked it free, retreating until her spine hit the carved wooden headboard. Her hands frantically patted the bedside table in the dark, her fingers closing blindly around the cold, heavy brass base of a candlestick. She dragged it against her chest, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The iron latch lifted with a metallic scrape. The door swung inward, hitting the wall with a dull thud. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint moonlight bleeding through the hall windows. He was entirely too tall, and he was not hunched. Beatrice pressed herself harder into the wood, squeezing her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. The man stepped inside, pushing the door shut with the heel of his boot. The smell hit her first. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the sour stench of old age. It was ozone, rain, damp wool, and the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine. A match flared loudly in the dark, the sulfur stinging Beatrice's nose. The man touched the flame to a lantern on the sideboard. The light bloomed, yellow and wavering, revealing the intruder. Beatrice's grip on the candlestick slipped, her sweaty palms failing her. It clattered against the bedside table. The man snapped his head toward the sound. He was young. He couldn't have been more than 28. Rainwater dripped from the dark, heavy wool of his riding cloak, pooling on the floorboards. His hair, a dirty, wind-blown blonde, was plastered against his forehead. Water tracked down the sharp angle of his jaw, dripping onto a thoroughly soaked cravat. He looked exhausted. Deep, purple shadows bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and a muscle in his cheek twitched as he stared at her. He didn't look mad. He didn't look dangerous. He looked profoundly, intensely irritated. "For God's sake," he muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet of the room. He reached up, roughly unfastening the brass clasp of his cloak. The heavy, wet fabric hit the floor with a sodden slap. Beatrice couldn't breathe. Her brain stalled, unable to reconcile the rumors with the reality standing in front of her. Was this the Duke's son, a nephew, an intruder who had bypassed the guards? Who? She started, but her voice cracked, coming out as a pathetic squeak. She cleared her throat, forcing the words out. Who are you? The man turned fully to face her, pulling off a sodden leather glove using his teeth. He tossed it onto a chair. I should be asking you that, considering you are currently trespassing in my bedchamber, holding my favorite candlestick like a bludgeon. My bedchamber. Beatrice's stomach dropped out. She scrambled off the bed, intending to stand straight to look dignified. Instead, her bare foot tangled in the yard of extra linen pooled at the floor. She pitched forward. She threw her hands out to catch herself, her elbow colliding violently with the corner of a heavy oak chest at the foot of the bed. Pain shot up her arm, sharp and electric. She gasped, a highly undignified noise, and crumpled onto her knees, clutching her funny bone. The man stared at her from across the room. He didn't rush forward to help her. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood there, letting out a long, slow exhale that sounded like a tire deflating. Well, he said flatly. That was graceful. You. Beatrice wheezed, tears of pure, unadulterated pain pricking her eyes. She refused to cry. She bit her lip until she tasted copper. You are not the Duke. The man walked toward a small side table, picking up a crystal decanter. He poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a glass. I assure you I am. Unless someone has overthrown me while I was inspecting the collapsed roof in the tenant village for the last 14 hours. He drank the whiskey in one swallow, his throat working. He set the glass down with a heavy clink and finally looked at her properly. The Duke of Rotherham is 70. Beatrice blurted out from the floor, rubbing her aching elbow, the absurdity of the situation overpowering her fear. He is 70, and he has weeping sores, and he barks like a dog. The young man paused. He leaned against the sideboard, crossing his arms over his damp waistcoat. A ghost of a bitter, cynical smile touched the corner of his mouth. Ah, he said, his voice dripping with dry sarcasm. You've been talking to the villagers. Commendable research. Unfortunately, you are referring to my father, who has been dead for 6 months. I am Gideon, the current, vastly less interesting and entirely exhausted Duke of Rotherham. Beatrice stared at him. The cold floor seeped into her knees. Her father hadn't known. Or worse, he had known and hadn't cared enough to correct her terror. Gideon pushed off the sideboard and took a step toward her. Beatrice flinched backward on instinct, a wounded animal bracing for a strike. He froze, his expression shuttered, the dry amusement vanishing instantly. He looked at her white-knuckled grip on her arm, the terror vibrating in her shoulders, the defensive curl of her posture. You're shaking, he observed. It wasn't a question. It wasn't sympathetic. It was a cold, hard fact. I am cold, she lied, her voice vibrating. Gideon stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he unbuttoned his damp waistcoat, stripped off his ruined cravat, and tossed them aside. He walked to the fireplace, grabbed an iron poker, and viciously stabbed at the dying embers. He threw 3 heavy logs onto the grate, ignoring her completely until the fire roared back to life, casting harsh, flickering light across the sharp planes of his face. Get up, he said, not turning around. Sit in the chair by the fire before you freeze to death. I have had entirely enough corpses in this house for 1 year, and I won't have you adding to the tally. Beatrice didn't move. They said you bought me. Gideon finally turned. The firelight caught the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. I bought a debt, he corrected, his voice rough. Your father threw you in as collateral to save his own neck. I didn't ask for a wife. I don't want a wife. But since you are here, and since I am too tired to ride back out into the storm, to drag him back, try not to break any more furniture. Heat blasted from the freshly stoked fire, aggressive and dry, stinging the frozen skin of Beatrice's face. She didn't move immediately. Her knee still rested on the cold floorboards, and her elbow throbbed, a steady, rhythmic warning against her ribs. She watched Gideon, the man who was legally her husband, drop into the opposing armchair. He didn't look at her. He leaned his head back against the dark leather, closed his eyes, and exhaled a breath that sounded like grinding stones. Beatrice pushed herself up, her joints popping in the quiet room. She gathered the ridiculous pooling yards of her stiff linen nightgown and dragged herself toward the fire. She didn't sit in the chair he had ordered her into. Instead, she sank onto the thick Persian rug directly in front of the hearth, pulling her knees to her chest. "I told you to sit in the chair," Gideon murmured. His eyes remained shut. "The floor is closer to the fire," she replied. Her voice was thin, raspy from disuse and lingering panic, but it didn't shake. He cracked one eye open, the firelight casting half his face in deep, skeletal shadow. He watched her for a long moment, taking in the way she hovered over the flames, like a starving dog over a scrap of meat. He let out a low noise in the back of his throat, something between a sigh and a scoff, and closed his eyes again. "Suit yourself. If you catch a chill and die, I'm leaving your body for Gable to deal with." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, with the smell of drying wool and burning pine. Beatrice watched the water steam off his discarded cloak near the door. The initial, blinding terror that had gripped her was slowly receding, replaced by a strange, hollow numbness. She was not dead. She was not going to be eaten or beaten by a madman. She was simply sitting on the floor of a drafty castle with a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a month. "Why didn't you correct him?" she asked. The words slipped out before her brain could filter them. Gideon didn't move, but the line of his jaw tightened. "Correct who?" "My father. He thought you were the old Duke. He thought he was selling me to a monster." Beatrice rubbed her arms, feeling the goose flesh pebbling her skin. "He didn't care, of course, but you must have known what he thought." Gideon finally sat forward. He rested his elbows on his knees, his large hands dangling loosely between them. Without the heavy coat, he looked leaner, the muscles in his forearms tense and corded beneath his damp shirt sleeves. "Your father," Gideon said, his voice flat and devoid of any polite inflection, "is a parasite. He owed my late father £4,000. When I took the title, I called in the debts. Your father arrived at my solicitor's office weeping, offering his only daughter to square the ledger." He reached out and grabbed the iron poker, turning a burning log. Sparks spat into the air, bright and angry. "I told my solicitor to refuse, to take the house in London instead." Beatrice flinched. "We don't own the house in London. It's leased." "Yes, we discovered that," Gideon said dryly. "When my solicitor threatened him with debtor's prison, your father drafted the marriage lines himself and forged my signature on the proxy. By the time the paperwork reached me here in Yorkshire, the marriage had been registered with the Archbishop. You were legally mine, and your father was legally debt-free." Beatrice stared into the fire. The flames blurred as hot, humiliating tears finally breached her control. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. She hated her father. She had always hated him, but the sheer, breathtaking cowardice of it felt like a physical blow to her stomach. "So you are stuck with me," she whispered. "I am stuck with a rotting roof, 300 starving tenant farmers, a mine that flooded last Tuesday, and a legacy of madness that has isolated this estate for 20 years. Gideon corrected harshly. "You, Beatrice, are just the cherry on top of a spectacular pile of manure." It shouldn't have comforted her, but it did. The sheer lack of romance in his assessment grounded her. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a villain. He was a man drowning in his own miserable reality, and she was simply a piece of driftwood that had hit him in the head. "I don't eat much," she offered, staring at her bare toes. Gideon let out a short, bark-like laugh that held absolutely no humor. He rubbed a hand over his face, smearing a streak of soot across his cheekbone. "Go to sleep. Take the bed." Beatrice looked at the massive four-poster. "Where will you sleep?" "Here." He gestured vaguely to the leather chair. "I am covered in mud and coal dust, and if I lie down on that mattress, I won't wake up for a week. Go." She didn't argue. Her body felt like it was made of lead. She crawled up into the bed, sinking into the feather mattress. The sheets were freezing, but the heavy velvet quilt trapped the heat of her skin instantly. She lay on the extreme edge, her back to him, staring at the faded floral pattern on the wallpaper. She listened to the rustle of his clothing, the heavy clunk of his boots hitting the floorboards, the soft clinking of glass as he poured another drink. Then silence, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. "Beatrice," his rough voice floated across the dark room. She stiffened. "Yes, my father was a monster," Gideon said quietly, the anger bleeding out of his tone, leaving only exhaustion. He locked his wives in the dark. He broke their fingers. He died screaming at phantoms. "I am not him. I don't want you, but I will not hurt you. You can sleep." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 days, she actually did. Dawn did not break over the Yorkshire moors. It merely diluted the darkness into a bruised, milky gray. The rain had stopped, but the wind continued to howl around the stone turrets, a high-pitched, mournful wail that rattled the glass in the window panes. Beatrice woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a fraction of a second she smelled stale tobacco and thought she was back in the carriage. Then the scent of cold ash and sharp leather registered. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim morning light, filtering through the heavy curtains. She was alone in the bed. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her body ached in new, spectacular ways. The bruise on her elbow was a violent purple, and the muscles in her neck were stiff from sleeping rigidly on her side. Gideon was still in the chair. He slept with the same tense aggression he possessed while awake. His head was thrown back against the leather, his jaw clenched tight. One arm hung off the side, his knuckles grazing the floorboards. His white shirt was crumpled and stained with soot, the top 3 buttons undone, revealing a strong, pale throat and a shadow of dark chest hair. In the harsh morning light, the exhaustion etched into his face was undeniable. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He looked entirely human, entirely mortal. A sharp, authoritative knock rapped against the heavy mahogany door. Gideon didn't stir. Beatrice froze. She pulled the velvet quilt up to her chin, her knuckles white. The knock sounded again, louder this time. The brass handle turned, and the door swung open. Mrs. Gable stepped into the room, followed by a young maid carrying a heavy silver tray. The housekeeper's face was an unreadable mask of pinched disapproval. Her dark eyes swept the room, landing first on the empty side of the bed, then on Beatrice huddled under the covers, and finally on Gideon, sprawled in the chair. A microscopic sneer touched the corner of Mrs. Gable's mouth. "Put it on the table, Mary," Mrs. Gable instructed the maid, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The clatter of porcelain against silver finally broke through Gideon's exhaustion. He flinched, his brow furrowing. He opened his eyes, blinking sluggishly at the ceiling for a moment, before dragging his gaze to the intruders. "What in God's name are you doing, Gable?" Gideon rasped, his voice rough with sleep. He scrubbed a hand over his face, wincing as he stretched his neck. "It is 8 o'clock, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said smoothly. "I brought breakfast and hot water for the Duchess." She paused before the title, injecting just enough hesitation to make it an insult. Gideon pushed himself up, his joints cracking loudly. He looked at the tray. 2 boiled eggs, a pot of tea, and a few dry slices of toast. He looked at Mrs. Gable. Then he looked at Beatrice, who was still clutching the blanket like a shield, staring at the housekeeper with wide, anxious eyes. "Get out," Gideon said. Mrs. Gable blinked. "Your Grace, the water will go cold." "I said get out," Gideon repeated, his voice dropping an octave, losing the gravel of sleep, and hardening into something cold and absolute. "And if you ever open my door again without waiting for a reply, I will dismiss you without a character reference. Do you understand?" The color drained from Mrs. Gable's face, leaving her sallow and gray. The ironclad authority in the room shifted instantly. The rumors of the old Duke's madness were terrifying, but Gideon's cold, rational anger was paralyzing. "Yes, Your Grace," she clipped out, her head bowing slightly. She turned on her heel and swept out of the room, the terrified maid scurrying behind her like a frightened mouse. The door clicked shut. Gideon stared at the door for a long moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Then he let out a heavy sigh, running both hands through his messy hair, making it stand on end. He walked over to the washstand, poured freezing water into the porcelain basin, and splashed it onto his face. He grabbed a towel, scrubbing at his skin violently. "She hates me," Beatrice observed softly from the bed. Gideon tossed the damp towel onto a chair. "Gable hates everyone. She hated my mother, she hated my father, and she hates me. She respects fear. My father gave her plenty of it." He walked over to the breakfast tray, picked up a piece of dry toast, and bit into it. He grimaced, chewing mechanically. He looked at Beatrice, his gaze lingering on the way she was practically suffocating herself with the blanket. "Are you going to hide in there all day, or are you going to eat?" he asked, pouring a cup of tea. It was black and steaming. He didn't offer to bring it to her. Beatrice slowly lowered the quilt. The cold air of the room bit through her thin, linen nightgown instantly. She slid her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet hitting the floorboards. She felt ridiculous. She felt entirely exposed, despite being covered from neck to ankle. She walked to the table, keeping a cautious distance between them. She reached for the other cup. Her hand trembled slightly, the cup rattling against the saucer. Gideon watched her hand shake. He set his own cup down. Without a word, he unfastened the top buttons of his waistcoat, the one he had discarded the night before, picked it up from the chair, and tossed it at her. It hit her in the chest. "Put that on. Your lips are blue, and I don't have time to dig a grave today," he muttered. Beatrice caught the heavy wool garment. It was massive, smelling faintly of the whiskey he had drank last night. She slipped her arms through the armholes. It fell past her thighs, swallowing her completely. But the residual warmth of the thick fabric was immediate and profound. She looked up at him. "Thank you." Gideon didn't smile. He just picked up his tea again. "Don't thank me. Just eat your eggs before they turn to rubber. We have to go downstairs in an hour, and I need you to pretend you aren't terrified of your own shadow." Breakfast tasted like cold clay. Beatrice forced half a piece of dry toast down her throat, swallowing past the tight knot in her esophagus. Gideon didn't watch her. He stood by the window, staring out at the rain-lashed moors, a silent, brooding monolith in his rumpled shirt. Mary, the terrified maid from earlier, returned an hour later carrying Beatrice's battered leather trunk. It hit the floorboards with a pathetic, hollow thud. The worn leather and rusted brass clasps looked entirely absurd against the backdrop of the velvet-draped bedchamber. Gideon vanished into an adjoining dressing room without a word, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. Beatrice was left to the awkward ministrations of the maid. "I can dress myself," Beatrice said quietly, taking a faded, dark green wool gown from the trunk. It had belonged to her aunt. It smelled faintly of camphor and damp cupboards, but it was sturdy. Mary wrung her red, chafed hands. "Mrs. Gable said I am to assist you, ma'am. Then you may lace the back. Tightly, please." The bodice pinched her ribs, restricting her breath just enough to make her feel tethered to her own body. She sat at the vanity, ignoring the silver-backed brushes laid out on the mahogany, and used her own wooden comb to drag her hair back. She twisted it into a severe, unyielding knot at the nape of her neck, pinning it until it pulled at her scalp. No soft curls, no trembling bride. When Gideon emerged, the transformation was jarring. He wore a severely cut jacket of dark charcoal wool, a stark white cravat knotted precisely at his throat, and boots polished to a brutal, mirror-like shine. The exhaustion still bruised the skin beneath his eyes, but the rumpled, sarcastic young man from the night before was gone. In his place stood the Duke of Rotherham, a man who commanded a starving estate, a flooded mine, and a bitter legacy. He paused, his pale eyes sweeping over her green dress, the rigid posture of her spine, the starkness of her hair. He didn't offer a hollow compliment. He didn't soften his gaze. "It will do," he stated flatly. "Are you ready?" "No," Beatrice answered, brutally honest. A harsh, brief exhale escaped his nose, a ghost of a laugh. "Good. The ones who think they are ready are usually the first to get eaten alive by this house. Stay close to me." Walking down the grand staircase in the daylight revealed the true decay of the Rotherham estate. The shadows of the night had hidden the water stains, blooming across the silk wallpaper like dark, spreading bruises. The air in the lower halls didn't just smell of cold stone. It smelled of deep, pervasive neglect. Mildew, rotting wood, generations of locked doors. 14 servants stood in a rigid line in the cavernous main hall. They were a bleak assortment of people, their faces pinched by years of serving a madman. They had survived the old Duke by being invisible, and they looked at Beatrice with a mixture of cold curiosity and dull resentment. Another mouth to feed. Another whim to cater to. Mrs. Gable stood at the head of the line, her hands clasped at her waist, her posture a steel rod. Gideon stopped on the bottom step, forcing the staff to look up at him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is Beatrice," he said. The gravel in his tone scraped against the dead acoustics of the stone hall. He didn't use her title. "She is my wife. You will treat her with the exact level of deference you show me. If she asks for a fire, you light it. If she asks for a meal, you cook it. If I hear a single whisper, a sigh, or a heavy footstep directed at her, you will find yourselves walking the moors, looking for employment. The tenure you held under my father means absolutely nothing to me." Silence rang in the hall, thick and suffocating. "Do we understand one another?" Gideon asked softly. A murmured, disjointed chorus of, "Yes, Your Grace," rippled through the line. "Gable," Gideon snapped. The housekeeper stepped forward, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "Your Grace, the Duchess will be taking over the household ledgers. Bring them to the morning room." Beatrice's head snapped toward him, her pulse spiking. She didn't know how to run a ducal estate. She knew how to stretch a pound of flour and avoid the butcher when her father's credit ran dry. Gideon didn't look at her. He kept his gaze pinned on the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable's eyes flared with poorly concealed outrage. "The ledgers, Your Grace? Surely the Duchess is too fatigued from her journey to trouble herself with accounts. I have managed them perfectly for 15 years. And for 15 years this house has bled money while smelling of damned dogs and sour milk," Gideon countered, his voice lethal. "Bring her the ledgers, now." Mrs. Gable's jaw locked. For a second, Beatrice thought the older woman might spit on the floor. Instead, she offered a stiff, jerky curtsy. "As you wish." As the servants dispersed, like cockroaches fleeing a lantern, Gideon turned on his heel, heading toward a set of heavy double doors down the corridor. Beatrice scrambled to keep up with his long, furious strides. "I cannot read an estate ledger," she hissed, grabbing his sleeve. The charcoal wool was rough under her fingers. He stopped so abruptly, she nearly collided with his chest. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up to her eyes. "You can count, can't you?" he asked. "Yes, but—" "Then you can read a ledger. Gable has been stealing from the household accounts since I was a boy. I haven't had the time to sit down and prove it because I've been trying to keep the tenant farmers from freezing to death. You are going to sit in a warm room, drink tea, and add up the columns. When you find the discrepancies, you will circle them in red ink." He stepped closer. The scent of ozone, lye soap, and cold anger radiated off his skin. "You are not a hostage here, Beatrice. Not anymore," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense hum. "Your father sold you to a monster, but the monster is dead in the ground. I am just a man trying to dig this estate out of a grave. If you want to survive this house, make yourself useful. Fight back." He pulled away, opening the doors to the morning room. Beatrice stood alone in the drafty corridor. Her chest heaved against the tight bodice of the green gown. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. A strange, unfamiliar heat began to bloom behind her ribs, a tiny, sharp spark of purpose. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped over the threshold, the heavy doors closing with a solid, echoing thud behind her. The morning room was surprisingly bright, dust motes dancing lazily in the gray light spilling through the tall windows. A massive oak desk dominated the center, stacked high with leather-bound books. Beatrice ran a finger across the worn, cracked spine of the topmost ledger. It felt heavy. It felt like a weapon. She pulled out the wooden chair, sitting down with a rigid spine. She unstoffered the inkwell, the sharp smell of iron gall cutting through the dusty air. Picking up a brass-nibbed pen, she dipped it, listening to the satisfying scratch of metal against paper. She wasn't a victim waiting in the dark anymore. She was the Duchess of Rotherham, and she had work to do. The fire is lit and Beatrice is finally fighting back. If you love this tense, slow burn, start to Gideon and Beatrice's unconventional marriage, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Will Beatrice uncover Mrs. Gable's dark secrets? Can this broken duke and cynical bride actually forge a real alliance? Or maybe something more? Share this video with your fellow historical romance junkies and drop a comment below on what you think happens next. See you soon.